Want to welcome everyone to the Oracle Class 305 on June the 17th, 2024. Okay, I'll put in the link, the presentation on women in the Manhattan Project. It was in the chat. I'm sorry, and the link goes back to where I made the presentation in February of this year. And there was a question about it last time about women in the Manhattan Project. So I put that link up and you can go and watch the video of that program and be able to get that presentation. Yes, I do. There's another waiting room. Okay. And we have Dennis Aslinger with us today. He's going to talk about the Prophet of Oak Ridge Revealed. Remember now, you're muted, but you can interrupt anytime and just unmute yourself and ask any questions that you want. And remember, I want your ideas. What do you have? What would you like for us to talk about that we're not including? You can go ahead and get started and go ahead and share your screen first so that we can see your presentation. And then talk to us about what research you've done on John Hendricks. Dennis is the great grandson of John Hendricks, and you all have heard me tell the story, I'm sure, about the Prophet of Oak Ridge. So we're going to learn some more about that today. Dennis, take it away.
Thank you, Ray. Morning, class. As Ray said, I wrote this book, The Prophet of Oak Ridge Revealed. I had so much data from doing genealogy about my great-grandfather that I thought it would be a good time to put it all down in writing for my children, if nobody else. And so what I'll do is work my way through this thing, kind of like the book is written, introduce John Hendricks and talk about his prophecies and then his legacy. And as part of it, we'll talk about the new things that I've discovered in recent months, literally recent months. That kind of prodded me into writing it, things that I found last year. So John Hendricks, the story of the Prophet of Oak Ridge, I learned from my grandmother, Linda Hendricks, in the 60s and 70s. We lived out in the country there. We didn't have access to the one book that I know of that was about John, or the newspapers from the 1940s. And she would tell me stories about him. Beginning in the 1980s, I collected the genealogy information, and I've been doing that for 4 decades. And then I made these recent discoveries that made me think that John had been a violent young man and strongly suggested he had abused his first wife. Now, these conclusions in no way diminish his prophecy. I think, to the contrary, they're integral to his journey of spiritual healing and redemption, without which there would have been no prophecy. So my goal in producing a book was to retell the story as accurately as possible by critically examining all of the earlier accounts and presenting the latest findings. The title kind of reflects the epiphany that I experienced while writing the book, which is that John's prophecy was the culmination of his life of violence, loss, contrition, and redemption. John's family had moved to Anderson County from Morgan County, Tennessee in mid-1865. And any counties that I reference are in Tennessee, unless I note different, which I think they all are. The Hendricks family may have been driven out of Morgan County because John's uncle, Alfred Wallace, was a Confederate soldier, and the vast majority of their neighbors were Unionists. There was actually a lawsuit against Alfred Wallace and a few other men, suing them for an enormous sum of money, like $50,000. Back then, that was a lot, for the killing of the woman's husband. And it was later dropped because I think they'd all left and they couldn't be found. John was born in Anderson County in late 1865. And by 1870, in the census, one of his siblings was missing. And before 1880, his mother and several other siblings had died of unknown causes. Then in April of 1888, he married Julia Ann Griffith, who was from Morgan County. And they had 5 children, and they lived near present-day Bull Run Steam Plant. And in about 1897, John had disciplined their second youngest child when she was sick, supposedly with diphtheria, and she died soon thereafter. Julia blamed John for the baby's death and left him, and taking the other children with her. She stayed with her mother in Morgan County, where they were enumerated in the 1900 census under the surname Griffith. And then later, Julia moved her children to Arkansas, where John could not find her, and he never saw his children again. So John was grieving for the loss of his family, and his behavior apparently became erratic, and he was confined on the Anderson County Poor Farm in the building known as the Insane Asylum. I don't believe that John was insane or even mentally ill, but I think he had a mental break, and they put him in there to keep him from maybe harming himself or others. There's no record of how or exactly when John was committed to the county farm, but he escaped in the spring of 1901, and later became ultra religious and making prophecies. And we'll talk about how we know that it was in the spring of 1901 shortly. John later married Blount County divorcee Martha Jane Whitehead Gregory in July of 1908, a few months after they bought adjoining properties in the area of Robertsville in Anderson County known as the Flatwoods. And this is where Hendricks Creek subdivision is in Oak Ridge today. John and Martha had one child together, Curtis Allen Hendricks, born in 1909, and he was my grandfather. John made his first prophecy after escaping from the Anderson County Poor Farm. And when the superintendent saw him outside the fence, John said, "Don't come after me. This place is evil, and God will burn it down within a month." And so the building on the Poor Farm, known as the Insane Asylum, had iron cages for those confined there, and it was struck by lightning and burned in the spring of 1901. It was one of several buildings on the farm. They were all built in 1895, and there's court records describing the materials purchased and what all was the size of each building, etc. When John reached his home after escaping, he placed a row of 8 stones in front of his home and said the Lord told him to put them there to smite his enemies. An alternative account says that he placed a sign in the yard that said, "Smite thine enemies." So the stone and possibly the sign were said to be responsible for the Poor Farm commissioners declining to apprehend John for a second time. So then we'll move on to John's prophecies. Well, of course, the first prophecy, I skipped one. I didn't know where he covered that. Okay, so his major prophecies, he predicted that L&N would build a rail line from Dossett, which is there in Anderson County, through Black Oak Ridge and through Elza to Knox County. And this line was built between May 1902 and April 1905. And he said that the tunnel would go through Black Oak Ridge and pass under Butcher Spring and sink it. He predicted the route of the rail line, and he predicted the location of the railway bridge over the Clinch River. And I pulled up old newspaper accounts of the railway being built, and there was a lot of speculation over the route of the railway. Nobody thought that it was going to go through Black Oak Ridge in a tunnel. They thought it was going to go to Clinton from Elza. And so it was a surprise to the people of Clinton when it went through the tunnel to Dossett. When John was out in the woods praying one day, he was looking up into heaven and he heard a voice speak to him as loud and as sharp as thunder, telling him to sleep on the ground for 40 nights, and he would be shown the future of this land for his home. And he did so, and sometime later he had what I call his prophetic vision. And it's been recounted that he said, Bear Creek Valley someday will be filled with great buildings and factories, and they will help toward winning the greatest war that ever will be. Big engines will dig big ditches, and thousands of people will be running to and fro. They will be building things, and there will be great noise and confusion, and the earth will shake. I've seen it, it's coming. There will be a city on Black Oak Ridge, and the center of authority will be on a spot that is middle way between Severe Tadlock's farm and Joe Pye's place. That's where the DOE office building is today. John said that L&N will build a rail spur from Elza to Scarborough. And he went so far as to notch trees and mark the route of the rail spur, the future roads, and the location of the center of authority. Now this line is different from the railway that went through the tunnel and across the Clinch River. It was a spur that it was like a branch line off of that line. And it was built, I think, starting in 1942. Newspaper columnist Bert Vincent quoted Paralee Raby in August 1946 as saying everything that had been written about her stepfather was so, and that everything that he prophesied had taken place. Now, an amazing fact about all of John Hendrick's prophecies that I just realized while writing this book, even though as familiar as I was with the story for many years, was that everything that he predicted and prophesied took place within 3 miles of his home there in what's Hendricks Creek subdivision today. He didn't mention anything outside of that radius. John made some of what I consider minor prophecies. When Murray Gregory, his stepson, complained about the large limestone rocks in the field that they were plowing, John told him, don't worry about those rocks. One day they'll be ground up to make lime. And the rocks were ground up for building material when Oak Ridge was built. John predicted that one day airplanes would carry passengers and freight. This prophecy was made in the early days of flight when airplanes were made of wood and fabric and were very small and no one saw practical use for it. And keeping in mind, he died before World War I, or actually World War I had just started when he died. And you've seen the old movies with airplanes having dog fights with the old biplanes. That's what planes were like at that time. So they didn't carry freight or passengers at that time. So one account said that John spent 3 weeks in paradise and he flew there in a white metal airplane with 200-foot long wings. And this was clearly a reference to a modern passenger jet because they didn't have planes made of metal in his day. They were too heavy for the engines available. John also named people around him that would be alive to see his vision of the Manhattan Project fulfilled, and he named the people who would not be alive, including himself. Now, I don't have any details on that prophecy about any names that he named other than himself. So then we come to the untold story, which based on records that I found last year, uh, court records, and newspaper accounts as well. In the spring of 1887, John Hendricks shot and killed a man named John Gallagher in Anderson County near Cobb's Ferry, very near the present-day Solway Bridge. Gallagher was walking home to Scarborough, where he lived, after visiting Hedgecock's store on the Knox County-Loudoun County line. And it was a pretty good walk, all the way from Scarborough to the bridge or the ferry, and then from the ferry all the way to the lower end of Knox County and back. Mr. Gallagher was a Confederate veteran of the Civil War, and he may have suffered from PTSD that made him violent. He'd been in the war for 3 years and was wounded at Chickamauga, and it was the bloodiest battle, or second bloodiest battle of the Civil War as far as casualties. So he'd seen some things, and it wouldn't be surprising that he might be violent. He was reputed to be a bully and had a history with the Hendricks family, and newspaper reports consistently said that John Hendricks had sworn as a youth to kill Gallagher when he came of age. And I believe that John Hendricks, it's my opinion, that John Hendricks waited on the road for Gallagher to return home from the store and kind of goaded him into attacking. And it probably didn't take much to get him to attack, because of his nature. It was said that when Gallagher saw him, he ordered him to go back across the river, and John refused. So then Gallagher went on the attack, and he began to beat John with a large stick. And then Hendricks killed him with 2 shots from a pistol. John Hendricks was represented at his preliminary hearing by the Justice of the Peace for the area of Knox County that he lived in, which was the 9th District, which is Solway and Hardin Valley areas today. He lived in Solway with his sister. That Justice of the Peace name was Willis Edward Hedgecock, and he was represented at trial by 2 prominent attorneys. John was poverty stricken, and I can see no way that he was able to afford representation. So this was a high profile murder trial, and I think they probably took the case just for the free publicity for their lawyer business. John lived at the time with his sister Phoebe Lee and her family in the Solway area, as I mentioned. In the 1880 census, he and his father both, and I think he was probably still there when the killing occurred. So John pleaded self-defense at his trial, and he was found innocent in October 1887. And the reason he was found innocent was because Mr. Gallagher had set his belongings down and walked back toward the ferry, because John was apparently behind him between Mr. Gallagher and the ferry. And that's where they found him when he'd been shot. And then John also had bruising on his arms where he was hit with the stick. So they concluded that he was defending himself. 6 months later, John married Julia Griffith, and they apparently had a troubled marriage. After their small daughter died, Julia filed for divorce in Morgan County sometime before July 1898. July 1898 was the first record I found of it where they were making a modification to their complaint of the existing case. So I don't know exactly when it was first filed. The divorce was finalized on July the 5th, 1900, and the judge found that proof amply sustains the allegations of the petitioner and that the defendant, John Hendricks, is guilty of the wrongs and injuries alleged in the petition. And unfortunately, the petition and testimony were not preserved. I checked with the Morgan County Archives and they did not have anything. So all we have then is the court minutes. The judge further found that the defendant, John Hendricks, is not the proper person to have the care and control of the minor children. So the killing of John Gallagher showed that John could be violent. And being found guilty of wrongs and injuries charged by Julia and losing custody of his children strongly implies that Julia was a battered wife. Their baby may have died of diphtheria, but it's possible that John shook the crying baby in frustration without knowing that it was dangerous to the baby. But whatever he did, John believed that he was responsible for the death of her child. Now, I think that Julia must have been terrified of John because she moved hundreds of miles away to Arkansas where she had no friends, family, or support system. She took her 4 children ranging in age from 4 to 11 years old, and they probably traveled via the Southern Railway from the depot at Lansing in Morgan County, which was only 8 miles from her mother's home, and went to Arkansas via Chattanooga and Memphis, which was the main line for the Southern in the area. And her final destination when she left in 1900 is unknown, but she later remarried in 1906 in Calhoun, Arkansas, which was the southwest corner of the state, which is 600 miles from her mother's home. So she was getting as far from John as she could. So after John Hendricks' escape from the poor farm commissioners reported to the Anderson County Quarterly Court on July 1901, July the 1st, 1901, that the insane asylum building had been struck by lightning and consumed by fire in the previous quarter. So the John Hendricks story then is a story of contrition and redemption, and I'm convinced that John had a religious conversion during his confinement because the people that knew John after his confinement, particularly Martha Jane, his second wife, never indicated that John was a violent man, and he gained the reputation of a devout, ultra-religious man. So I think his nature changed after being confined, and we didn't see any evidence of violence after that. I tried to form a timeline for John Hendricks' predictions and prophecy, and I believe that his first prediction was the destruction of the insane asylum building in the spring of 1901. Now, some have said that he was making predictions when he was during his first marriage in the 1890s, but I don't believe that to be true. I think he had more things to worry about with all those children and keeping them supported in the 1890s. So he had a lot more time to himself after that. His second prediction was probably the construction of the L&N rail line through Black Oak Ridge and through Elsa and across the Clinch River and on to Knoxville. And construction started in the spring of 1902, so his prediction had to have been before then. Now concerning, so James Braden was a young neighbor of John's when John was making these predictions. And in 1944, he recalled that John Hendricks' wife recounted that John excitedly told her about the voice telling him to sleep on the ground for 40 nights. So this wife had to be Martha Jane, and the event had to be after July 1908 when John and Martha were married. Uh, and then Mr. Braden said that John had the prophetic vision after he overheated while making hay. So the earliest date then for this prophetic vision had to be spring, summer 1909, and the latest date would be spring, summer 1914. John was gravely ill by 1915 and would have been unable to work. So that's how we put the end point on the possible timeline there. And no other prediction included datable information. So my effort at a timeline was relatively fruitless, but I think I nailed down the first prediction and an end point for possible the big prediction, the prophetic vision, as I call it. Um, Concerning that prophetic vision, John did not say if he was asleep or awake when he had the vision. He didn't say if there was a speaker in the vision, but if there had been a speaker, he would surely have quoted the speaker because of he was very excited about the voice telling him to sleep on the ground. So I'm pretty sure that he would have quoted a speaker in this vision. While John was very religious, his prophecy was not religious in nature. There were no moral lessons, no repent or else. Uh, he was said to have prayed about the future of his home area, and so his vision was a very specific answer to the prayer. As I said before, the events described in his vision and all his predictions all occurred within 3 miles of his home. He didn't mention the K-25 plant or the Oak Ridge National Laboratory. He didn't talk about uh, World War II specifically. Um, it's kind of funny to me that he never said anything about World War I, which started during his lifetime. Um, it's just strange to me. Uh, Unfortunately, John's prophecies were not documented during his lifetime. Many people take the position that if it's not in writing, it didn't happen. And I think that even if John had written about his visions, people would still be skeptics, saying that the writings were fake. A recent article appeared in an online magazine called Skeptical Inquirer that came out after I'd published my book. An article suggested that John's friends and family manufactured details such as the route of the rail spur after the vision came true in order to burnish his reputation. This article quoted the newspaper columnist Bert Vincent often, and Bert Vincent misquoted James Braden often. And Mr. Braden was occasionally wrong about details. You see, there's a lot of opportunity there for things to go astray. Bert Vincent, yeah, he worked for a newspaper and he visited people and asked questions as journalists do, but his column was more of humorous entertainment than serious journalism. When government agents began serving notice to residents that they had only a few weeks to vacate their properties, Martha Jane Hendricks met my grandmother, Linda Hendricks, at the spring near their home and said, "Looks like old John Hendricks was right." So that shows that, they were, the family, or my grandmother in particular, were already well versed in John Hendricks's prophecy before it happened, before it came true. Uh, my grandmother was just a little girl when he made these prophecies and didn't know the Hendricks family. She was from the Haney family in Anderson County. The government condemned 59,000 acres in Anderson and Roane counties in November 1942, and Martha J. Hendricks and Kurt Hendricks' family were among the approximately 3,000 people that were displaced. In the communities of Elza, Robertsville, Scarborough, and Wheat depopulated and ceased to exist. Kurt Hendricks moved his family to Union County and later was able to work in Oak Ridge, but had to live away from his family, staying in the Guthrie Hall Dormitory, which is in the West Village over near the Jefferson Circle, the name of the street. While he was in the dormitory away from home, he wrote letters to his mother, Martha Jane Hendricks, and one of them was postmarked March 24th, 1944. In referring to Oak Ridge, he said, "My dad said that place would be builded, and they said he was crazy. Who was crazy?" Kurt visited the Hendricks home place in his free time, and he wrote another poignant, undated letter to his mother about the visit. He said, "Your apple trees look fine. They have apples on them as big as partridge eggs, and there are plenty of them. The roses are in full bloom and very pretty, and things look full of life and promise. I pulled the weeds and briars off my daddy's grave, made 2 bouquets of roses, and put them on his grave. I wonder if he has any way of knowing that I did so." Shortly after that, Kurt was murdered by 2 Union County neighbors on July the 9th, 1944. Now, it was important to me to establish all the facts available, because skeptics seize upon any inconsistencies, particularly when the subject is prophecy, which many disbelieve on principle. My book attempts to identify previous errors without being critical of the earlier writers, because they were only depending on the information that was available to them. Sometimes they just filled in gaps with bad information. I don't know where they may have gotten it. One example is the book from 1950. Mr. Robinson said that John died in, I think, 1903, when he actually died in 1915. So you can see that threw his timeline off considerably when the prophecies were made. My book compiles all the predictions, prophecies. It corrects errors found in other sources. It documents previously unknown records, establishes a time frame for some predictions and prophecies, provides citations and a bibliography, and it includes, as a bonus, includes chapters on genealogy and on John's son, Kurt. Now, new details may continue to emerge. Just recently, I found 2 documents in possession of the Oak Ridge Public Library that reference John Hendricks' trial. These papers were promissory notes from John Gallagher's brother, Evan, to lawyers for services rendered in prosecuting John Hendricks. Now, I find that odd that private citizen is paying lawyers to assist the state's prosecutors in a case. I don't know why he would do that. Anyway, that concludes my presentation. It's kind of an abrupt end. I think the story of John Hendricks kind of ends abruptly. His legacy may continue to go on with all his descendants that still live in the area. And as I said, I wrote this book I may not have said, I wrote it for my daughters, so that they would have it and that they would know a part of their family history, which is also local history. And the book is available on Amazon if anybody wants it. So that's all I have, Ray.
All right. Stop your share. And we'll let anyone who has any questions. Dennis, let me change our view here. If you have questions, just unmute yourself and ask Dennis any questions you want to about his presentation.
Hey, Ray.
Yes.
This is Sue Lasky,
Hey,
and I was wondering, we hear a lot about John Hendricks and his farm, but I don't know exactly where the farm was or where his house was.
okay. We can we can identify that for you, and I'll start, and Dennis, you can add to it if you want. But if you go in Hendricks Creek subdivision and go to 123 Hendricks Drive, you'll find in a vacant lot there, which is an adjoining lot to the 123 address, you'll find the tombstone for that's on John Hendrick's grave. Now that tombstone is not the original one. The original one, Ed Westcott made photographs of it and gave me a copy of it, and I've included it in Historically Speaking and in other articles that I've written about John. But it was stolen off the grave at some point, and a class of Robertsville, when it was Robertsville Junior High, I know, I think it was, could have been when
Jefferson.
it was Jefferson. It was Jefferson Junior High, but located at the Robertsville location. And the teacher and the students collected enough money to purchase that stone. And I believe, Dennis, it was in the 60s when they did that. Or do you have that data?
I believe that's correct.
Yeah. And so that's the tombstone that's there today. Now, if you go on around Hendricks Drive to the next opportunity to turn left, and you make that left, and then you immediately make the next right into a cul-de-sac, you'll come to the location of the spring that starts Hendricks Creek subdivision. It's right in the front yard of a house there. You can't miss it. It's a big hole in the ground, and that's where the creek starts. And his home place was right adjacent to that spring, just a little bit to the north and the west. There's a house there now, but at the time when I made the documentary film about John Hendricks, that was a vacant lot. So we actually used that lot in the filming of the documentary. And I think I've told you all this before, but I'll remind you again. You can get to that documentary by going to the Y12 website, clicking on About, and then click on History, and then the video gallery, and that will bring up all those documentary films that I produced or helped to produce. And John Hendricks is one of them. But that's the location of his home place. I believe, Dennis, the 15 acres that he gave to Parlee Raby. And Parlee was, her home was just a little bit down the creek, a little further. It'll be south and west, and that's where he stayed. She kept him after he got so sick with tuberculosis, and she kept him until he passed away. And he gave her that 15 acres. Now, Dennis, you modify anything I said there, or correct any of it if it's wrong.
I believe that's correct.
All right. Sue, that'll
Uh,
help you locate where the farm was. Okay.
I can show them the book. If
Yeah, go ahead. There you go. The
This is what it
profit
looks
of,
like.
yeah, Profit of Oak Ridge Revealed. It's also available in museums in Oak Ridge, but it's readily available on Amazon. Let's talk just a little bit about your grandfather, Curtis.
Okay.
Yeah, he was a fairly interesting individual, and one of the things that I liked about it and learning about him, and I learned it mostly from you, is that he wrote a poem, and I believe the poem is included in your book,
Yes.
and the poem is, and he writes it, and you can tell when he's writing it that he's upset about having his farm taken away from him, and not knowing what everything is happening, but for some reason he blamed it on Eleanor Roosevelt, and I thought,
Well, actually, the title is "The Planned and Organized Society."
Oh, okay, yeah, but
Sponsored by
he ends
Eleanor.
it with that comment, don't he?
Yeah, he ends it with "I'm scared of Eleanor." Now he was just kidding. He was a
Okay.
big fan of the Roosevelts.
Oh,
Uh, I'll give you an example. I didn't mention this in the book, I don't think, but um, his mother being from Blount County, which is heavily Republican area. Uh, well, his mother was from there, and so he was a convert. Uh, this was during the Depression. He he didn't like Hoover, and he trained his dog to. He say, "Would you rather vote for Hoover or die?" And the dog would roll over and play dead, and he would do that to provoke his mother. And I'll also say that there are letters. He wrote another letter to his mother that said he was glad to give up his property in Oak Ridge to help to win the war.
yeah.
My mother never shared that. I mean, she lost her father at age 5, and she held that against Oak Ridge for the rest of her life. So,
And there another twist to that particular murder of your grandfather is there was never anyone prosecuted for that, was
that's correct. They made up a big lie, and they let him get away with it. No, it was never even reported in the papers. You know,
So why, do you know why he was killed? Was there enmity between the neighbors?
the one neighbor was a really bad person. Um, my grandfather um, had a run in with him in the past, and the guy was getting revenge on him. The man had cut his brother-in-law up with a knife pretty bad, and his brother-in-law was scared of him. And they had shared rides riding to work at one of the TBA dams. My grandfather drove, and the guy told my grandfather he couldn't ride with him anymore. And he asked him why, and he said his brother-in-law was going to kill him if he saw him again. And my grandfather, who he was a badass, to put it mildly, he told the guy not to worry about it. Said he said if he pulls that knife on you, I'll make him eat it. And sure enough, the guy pulled the knife in the car. My grandfather stopped the car, drug him out, punched him out, knocked him out cold, folded that hawkbill knife up, stuck it in his mouth, and shoved it in with his boot. So this gentleman, as you can imagine, didn't like that. And so unfortunately, they were neighbors, and he would come around. He had come around cursing on a Sunday. My grandmother asked my grandfather to get him away from her children with his bad language. My grandfather had took him home. He came back. There was another incident where my grandfather had to punch him out. He came to my grandfather's house. He pulled that knife out again. He said, "For 50 cents, I'd kill you with this knife." And my grandfather flipped him a 50-cent piece, and the guy lunged at him. And my grandfather punched him and knocked him out. So there was some history between those two. And so there was another neighbor that was of a bad sort. So they made up a story that my grandfather had assaulted his invalid mother, uh, something ridiculous like that. This happened in Union County.
well, that's a that's a sad end to a man's life. I hate to hear that, and especially
And I didn't say this in this presentation, but for the class's benefit, my grandfather had 7 children at the time, and my grandmother was pregnant with their 8th. They'd already had one child that died, not including him. They had 7, and she didn't even know she was pregnant yet. So she had to move all those children from Union County back to Anderson County, closer to her family, which is where I grew up. And then my aunt, Shawley Jane Hendricks, was born in 1945 next year.
Now this one says, I bought a vacant lot on Holbrook Lane and built a house on it 5 years ago. The railroad tracks, future greenway, runs right across my backyard. There's a sinkhole on the other side of the tracks and has a small creek that runs through my neighbor's front yard to the east of me. Am I on John's farm or homestead? That's it. And if you're looking right at Holbrook, there's the house on the right, the first one on the right at the end of the cul-de-sac is where that spring is. And that new house that's got the very white driveway is right on John Hendricks' home place. So, Sue, I think you're right there. Well, this is good for Sue to find out the history of her home place. That's great.
I just wish I'd gotten to know my grandfather. I mean, he died many years before I was born.
Right, I understand. There's another, just a quick anecdote about him that I remember from somewhere, and you can probably enlighten us a little bit about it. He was a fairly strong individual and delighted in showing that he could pick a car up. Do you have any details on that?
Well, my grandmother used to tell me stories about that as well. When he was younger, he was prone to drink, and he would show off his strength. He would drive his car into the ditch on purpose, and he'd get a crowd around wondering how he was going to get it out, and he would just grab a hold of the bumper and lift it out one end, and get on the other end, lift the other end out, and drive off. He once they claimed he had a resemblance to one of those 1930s famous John Dillinger. That's who it was. One time he drove up to the service station and said, "Fill it up quick, I'm John Dillinger." And the guy was very nervous. He filled up his tank and he drove off.
Oh, man. Oh, my goodness.
Yeah, he apparently got arrested more than once for doing things. And my grandmother would go and give the judge $50 to lose the paperwork and get him out of jail because she needed somebody to support those kids.
Yeah.
But I don't have any specifics on any of that. Just what she
There's
told me.
no documentation on that because they threw away the paper.
Lost the papers.
All right. Okay. Well, Dennis, thank you very much for coming and sharing with us a story about John Hendricks Revealed, a Prophet of Oak Ridge Revealed. You've done some excellent research, and I've told you this before. Dennis and I go back a ways. When I first started telling the John Hendricks story and writing about it, he contacted me and gave me some really good information that I've used over the years. And although he didn't go into it much today because he knows that genealogy gets real boring to people who are not personally involved in it, but he has done a lot of research in the genealogy of his family and includes that in the book too for anyone interested. But he knows that that's only of interest to people who are involved in it more so than the story of John. And I appreciate that he brought a lot of new information out to go in this book. So thank you very much for spending time with us this morning and giving us insight. Any other questions on Dennis before we leave that subject? All right, Dennis, thank you a lot. Now the comment, yeah, you bet. And the question about the history of residential housing in Oak Ridge, I would tell you that the Oak Ridge History Museum has the best displays of the early housing that you're going to find anywhere. The floor plans are there for all the alphabet houses, some good pictures of them, and they're all in the boardroom. If you come into the History Museum and just turn to the right and go down the hallway just a little ways and take the door to the right and go into that boardroom. That room is got the pictures on the wall and the floor plans on the wall. And then there's some books laying on the table that has the detailed floor plans for all of the alphabet housing. Now, I don't know if Gary, if that was what you had in mind and what you're interested in. Of course, you can see the original housing all around Jackson Square, that whole area in the east end of Oak Ridge. There are still almost all of those homes are original. Some of them have brick siding on them, some have aluminum siding, but there are a few that still have the cemesto siding. You can find two of them on Georgia Avenue, just about, I don't know, not even a eighth of a mile, just a few hundred yards up the road up Georgia Avenue from Big Ed's Pizza Place. If you look to the right as you're going up the hill, there's one that has a blue roof and one that has a red roof, both of them metal roofs. And they have the original cemesto siding still visible on those two houses. Of course, and if you go on up just a little bit, you'll see the D house. And the way you can tell a D house is the roof line is split. There's two levels of the roof line. And there's one up there that has little eagles all along the edge of the roof, little metal eagles set up there. And that's where Ed Westcott lived after he came back to Oak Ridge and retired here. And the lady that owns that house is proud to have Ed Westcott's house. And of course, if you go on up Georgia and you get up to Outer Drive and take a right and then a quick left, you'll be on Olney Lane. And if you go up to the top of Olney Lane to the cul-de-sac, the house on the right at 111 Olney Lane was the house where Colonel Nichols lived. And of course, if you're looking to see the different houses, you can identify the A's and the B's. They're just the small houses. They're 2 bedrooms. And you can identify a C house because it'll be a B that's just got a bedroom added onto the front. So it'll be an L-shaped house. That makes the C houses easy to recognize. Is there specific questions, Gary, that you had about the housing in Oak Ridge that you'd like me to focus on?
Yes, thanks, Ray. I was interested in the timing.
Okay.
I heard that the houses went up, multiple houses in a single day, and they must have had quite a construction crew and
Yeah.
just the logistics and management of materials to build a city that quickly is quite astounding.
Yeah, you're exactly right. The stories told about the young boy that went to school, and when he came home that day, he couldn't find his house because they'd built an entire subdivision around it. And even the comment is made in, I believe it's in City Behind the Fence. I don't remember exactly where the reference comes from, but it's a comment that they were completing a house every 30 minutes. Now, to do that, you've got to have a huge construction workforce, and you got to remember that many of these houses were prefabricated houses. They were going up quickly, and they started out thinking that they were going to build a city for 3,000 people. Then all of a sudden it's 13,000 people, and eventually it was 75,000 people. So they did build a city rapidly, and again, all different kinds, the flat tops, the hutments, just plywood, 16 by 16, with no windows, just flaps for windows. So and they brought trailers in. They did anything they could think of to get enough housing for the population. Interesting note about the layout of the city. When General Groves first started trying to get the contract to build the city, he went to Stone and Webster. Now, Stone and Webster was building the Y-12 plant, and he asked them to design a city. And they just made some drawings that had a layout of a town in with streets squared off. And he said, no, you don't understand. You don't know the lay of the land down there. That won't work. So he went and got Skidmore, Owens, and Merrill to design the layout of the city. And they took into account the contours of the land and laid the city out the way it is. Of course, it's not laid out with a downtown. There's no square, and that the various communities that were established, like Jackson Square was the most prominent one. It was called the town site, and was the one that that had the largest commercial establishments there. But there was also Elm Grove. There was Jefferson Center, Jefferson Circle, and Jefferson Center, and of course Grove Center. And these were just laid out so that there would be commercial areas there. There would be theaters. There would be cafeterias, recreation halls. I think it was a unique and very thoughtful layout for creating the town of Oak Ridge, and especially for it to be able to grow to the extent that it did, to 75,000 people in August of 1945. But you're right, there was a tremendous construction project. Now, think about this. Not only was the city being built, but all three of the locations, 4 if you count S50, were being built at the same time. At one time, at the height of construction activities, there were 80,000 people working here in Oak Ridge. So they had a tremendous amount of construction activities going on. Maybe that helps a little bit to shed a little light on what was going on.
Thank you, Ray.
Yeah.
One other question. I don't know what the time constraints are, but I heard that hutments were originally intended to be temporary structures, but it turned out that they were occupied longer than originally anticipated. Was that due to money constraints, or was there more going on there?
Well, there's a couple of things happening. A lot of hutments were built out at Happy Valley, which was just across Highway 58 from the K-25 site, and it was built as a construction site. There were 15,000 people living out there, but they demolished Happy Valley soon after they completed the construction at K-25. Now, there were hutments in Oak Ridge. Primarily, they were located where the woodland area is now, right where Aubrey's restaurant is. That area was the hutments primarily for the black people, the African Americans. Now, when they came in here during the Manhattan Project, this was a segregated South. They didn't even allow them to bring their children or to live together as families. They put the men in one set of hutments and the women in another, put a fence around the women, put a guard on it. Katie Strickland realized if she made some biscuits and gave them to the guard, she might get her husband to stay with her longer. So we have her biscuit pan, by the way, out at the K-25 History Center. But those hutments were occupied up until about 1946, so a little bit after the war ended. But then they moved the African Americans over into Gamma Valley and gave them houses and let them start bringing their children in, created a school over at the Scarborough School. By the way, that's how the Scarborough community got its name. In 1949, Arizona officer who was the principal moved the school over to Gamma Valley to a vacant school. Now remember, from 75,000 people, Oak Ridge went down to probably 30 something thousand in just a matter of months after the war ended. So they didn't need all of those 10 schools that they built. Some of them were not occupied. So she moved that school into that Gamma Valley area, and the students wanted to bring the name with them. So they brought the name Scarborough over for that school, and eventually the community adopted the name for the community. So that's how Scarborough got its name. But the hutments were never intended to be permanent housing. They were built for construction workers primarily, and then they put all of the African Americans there as well. Does that help a little?
Thank you, it does.
All right, very good. Well, we're about out of time. Thank you all very much for joining me today, and come back next Monday. I'm going to have an unusual guest with me. Cameron Reed is going to be here, and he's going to talk about a book that he's created called the Manhattan Project Encyclopedia. So you'll be getting some information there that is not readily known and will be a good insight into details about the Manhattan Project that you probably have never heard of before. So thank you all very much for joining me today, and we'll see you.
Thank you.
See you next Monday.
Thank you.
You bet.